in the heart of a pristinely manicured suburb, where every hedgerow was trimmed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel and each mailbox shone like a freshly minted coin, there existed an enclave that many would envy, if only they could fathom the absurdity simmering beneath its polished exterior. This is where our unlikely hero, Judge Alexander, made his home. A federal judge by title and a connoisseur of fine irony by nature, Alexander was known for his impeccable taste in both justice and subtle sarcasm. His reputation for being both unyielding in his rulings and wryly humorous in his observations had earned him a peculiar kind of celebrity status among his peers, and, as fate would have it, among his neighbors as well. Judge Alexander, a man whose demeanor could chill the air in a room while simultaneously warming it with his occasional sardonic wit, had long retired from the bench only in name. His mind, still razor-sharp and honed by years of dissecting legal conundrums, found no rest when faced with the ludicrous antics unfolding in his community. For within the realm of this suburban utopia lurked Mr. Charles, a man who fancied himself the sovereign of the Homeowners Association, HOA, with all the pomp and circumstance of a self-appointed monarch. Mr. Charles was no ordinary HOA leader. Picture, if you will, a man who had read every regulation, bylaw, and parking permit manual available, yet somehow twisted them into a personal playbook of tyranny. Clad in a suit that was always one size too tight and sporting a tie that screamed, "I mean business," Charles strutted about the neighborhood with an air of grandiosity that was as comical as it was unnerving. He had transformed mundane community rules into an elaborate tapestry of bizarre edicts, from mandating that all lawns be mowed in perfectly straight lines, with a protractor no less, to forbidding the joyous sound of children's laughter after 8 p.m., a measure, he argued, necessary to preserve the sanctity of quiet living. The stage was set and the players were in place. Judge Alexander, whose evenings were once spent with a glass of fine whiskey and a classic legal treatise, now found himself increasingly preoccupied by the ludicrous governance of Mr. Charles. The irony was not lost on him. Here was a man, so desperate for control, who saw his role as both judge and executioner in a microcosm of suburban absurdity. It was as if the HOA had become his personal stage for enacting a twisted, yet oddly mesmerizing, theatrical performance. As the golden rays of dusk bathed the neighborhood in a soft, forgiving light, the community gathered for what was officially termed a neighborhood meeting. In reality, however, it was a showdown between the forces of rationality and the tyranny of petty regulations. At the head of the gathering, with a clipboard that seemed to symbolize the weight of bureaucratic oppression, Mr. Charles proclaimed his latest decree, the banning of mismatched garden gnomes. Yes, mismatched garden gnomes. A subject that sparked an uproar of whispered debates among the residents who had painstakingly curated their front yards into expressions of individuality. To Mr. Charles, however, such minor aesthetic deviations were tantamount to anarchy in its purest form. It was during these moments of collective dismay and reluctant resignation that Judge Alexander's inner fire was kindled. For beneath his calm exterior lay the heart of a man who had seen the scales of justice tip too far in favor of irrational authority time and time again. The absurdity of it all, the ludicrous rules, the petty punishments, and the sheer audacity of Mr. Charles's self-appointed power spurred Alexander to consider a form of retribution that was as clever as it was inevitable. The irony of living in such a meticulously curated community was that every detail was designed to enforce conformity. Yet it was this very rigidity that made the residents' lives simultaneously comfortable and suffocating. The manicured lawns and perfectly aligned mailboxes masked a simmering discontent, a silent rebellion waiting for the right moment to burst forth in a spectacular display of vindication. And who better to ignite this rebellion than Judge Alexander, the embodiment of justice with a twist of dark humor. In his study, a sanctuary lined with books on legal philosophy, history, and an impressive collection of satirical novels, Judge Alexander began to draft his plans. He envisioned a series of carefully orchestrated events that would not only expose the inherent absurdity of Mr. Charles's draconian rules, but also serve as a cathartic act of retribution for all those who had been marginalized by the tyrant's relentless pursuit of order. Each stroke of his pen was imbued with both the precision of a seasoned jurist and the mischievous glee of a man who relished in the prospect of poetic justice. As he plotted, Alexander mused over the peculiarities of his own existence. Here he was, a federal judge, accustomed to the solemnity of courtrooms and the gravitas of legal proceedings, finding himself embroiled in a battle against a suburban despot. The transformation was as unexpected as it was delightful. Gone were the days when his days were filled solely with interpreting statutes and delivering verdicts. Now, he was poised to orchestrate a performance that would make even the most stoic legal minds crack a wry smile. The contrast between Judge Alexander and Mr. Charles couldn't have been starker. Where Alexander's humor was subtle and laced with irony, Mr. Charles's demeanor was as pompous as it was rigid. Charles prided himself on his unyielding dedication to community standards, a phrase he wielded like a weapon to justify the unreasonably strict measures he imposed. Yet, behind his austere facade lay a man who was as insecure as he was power-hungry. A man whose every decree was a desperate attempt to mask his own vulnerabilities. This clash of personalities set the stage for what would soon become an epic showdown. Alexander, with his deep understanding of the law and a keen sense of the absurd, recognized that the true battle was not merely over mismatched garden gnomes or overzealous lawn maintenance guidelines. It was a battle for the soul of the community, a struggle against the encroachment of tyranny disguised as order. And in this struggle, the judge was not just a bystander. He was an active participant, a rebel with a cause, and a man on a mission to restore a semblance of rationality to a place that had long lost its sense of humor. Thus, as the meeting came to a close and the residents dispersed with murmurs of discontent and reluctant resignation, Judge Alexander sat back in his chair, a wry smile playing on his lips. The absurdity of the day had only reinforced his determination. He knew that the time for subtle jabs had passed. The time for decisive, satirical retribution was at hand. With the precision of a legal scholar and the flair of a seasoned performer, he prepared to take on the formidable Mr. Charles in a battle where the scales of justice would be balanced not just with legal rigor, but with a generous dose of biting, irreverent humor. In the weeks following that fateful neighborhood meeting, the once sleepy suburb transformed into a stage for a farcical yet infuriating power play. Mr. Charles, ever the self-appointed arbiter of perfection, began unleashing a torrent of bizarre regulations that made the community's previous strictures seem like mere suggestions. His latest mandate, the color of every shrub had to match the approved palette he'd published in his monthly newsletter. A palette so obscure and overly specific that even a chameleon would be confused. It wasn't long before whispers of discontent spread among the residents, who found themselves increasingly entangled in a web of petty rules designed solely to showcase Mr. Charles's egotistical flair. Every morning, as the sun cast its early glow over the meticulously trimmed hedges and symmetrically aligned flower beds, residents would step out onto their porches to scrutinize one another's compliance. Did you see Mrs. Peterson's azaleas? They're sporting a shade of red that's clearly not on Mr. Charles's approved list. One would exclaim in hushed tones, not out of genuine concern for horticulture, but because the absurdity of it all fueled a shared sense of rebellion. It was a spectacle of self-importance and hypocrisy that drew both amusement and exasperation from all corners of the community. Meanwhile, Judge Alexander, though officially retired from the bench, couldn't help but keep a keen eye on the unfolding drama. His evenings, once reserved for leisurely legal texts and a fine glass of bourbon, were now dedicated to dissecting the legalese-laden memos and circulars issued by Mr. Charles. Each new rule was an exercise in bureaucratic absurdity, a twisted satire of what the law was meant to be. Alexander's analytical mind, honed by years of dissecting real legal challenges, recognized that these farcical decrees were not just harmless eccentricities. They were deliberate acts of authoritarian pettiness that undermined the community's spirit. The tension reached a boiling point one breezy afternoon when Mr. Charles decided that the neighborhood needed an orderly environment at the local park. His solution: a mandate forbidding excessive laughter after 7 p.m. The justification was as flimsy as it was laughable. According to Mr. Charles, uncontrolled laughter was the precursor to chaos, a slippery slope that could eventually lead to a full-scale mirth insurrection. Armed with a list of prohibited chuckles and snickers, he dispatched community officers to patrol the park, ready to issue citations for any display of joy that exceeded the prescribed decibel limit. Residents, naturally, were incensed. Children's playful giggles and even the occasional cackle from an amused couple were met with stern warnings, and, in some cases, absurd fines that could rival the cost of a new car. The shock and outrage were palpable, as families found themselves having to monitor their laughter with the vigilance of secret agents. Social media groups formed overnight, with residents sharing videos of their clandestine laughter sessions, mocking Mr. Charles's ludicrous rule with hashtags like #LaughFreeOrDie and #SilentRebellion. Yet, perhaps the most egregious act of mischief was yet to come. In a masterstroke of malevolence mixed with a twisted sense of humor, Mr. Charles orchestrated what could only be described as a false violation festival. Under the guise of routine inspections, he arranged for certain officers, loyal to his cause, to deliberately fabricate minor infractions. It started innocuously enough, a resident's mailbox being slightly askew or a garden hose left unrolled. But soon, the fabricated infractions escalated. People found themselves receiving notifications for unauthorized sprinkler use, excessive curbside cheerfulness, and even misappropriation of sunlight, all meticulously documented and presented as irrefutable evidence of their transgressions. Each fabricated violation came with an outrageously steep fine that was designed less to punish and more to humiliate. Mr. Charles took perverse delight in these actions, convinced that he was upholding the community's dignity while simultaneously asserting his absolute power. His proclamations, delivered through elaborately worded memos, dripped with self-satisfaction. A master of absurdity, he believed that his bizarre edicts would eventually force the residents into submission, proving that his brand of authoritarianism was the only path to true order. But as the days turned into a veritable parade of petty punishments, the community's collective ire began to simmer into a quiet yet potent resistance. Judge Alexander, with his razor-sharp wit and an ever-growing repository of humorous legal insights, saw these fabricated fines as the perfect catalyst for a counteroffensive. He began to document every absurdity with meticulous detail, amassing a dossier that was equal parts legal evidence and comedic gold. His study, filled with towering piles of memos, infractions, and hastily scribbled notes, became the war room from which he would eventually launch his satirical retribution. Alexander's preparations were methodical yet laced with the charm of a seasoned prankster. He started by discreetly reaching out to the community's more legally inclined residents, a motley crew of accountants, retired lawyers, and even a couple of local teachers with a penchant for civil disobedience. Together, they began to craft a plan that would expose Mr. Charles for the petty tyrant he truly was. Their strategy was simple: gather incontrovertible evidence of the false violations, highlight the ludicrousness of the fines, and then, in a dramatic showdown, present the accumulated documentation in a way that left no doubt about Mr. Charles's misuse of power. As the fabricated infractions piled up, so too did the hilarity of the situation. One particularly memorable incident involved a resident who was fined for excessive admiration of floral symmetry after being caught taking a photograph of her perfectly aligned rose bushes. The memo, complete with a diagram showing the improper angle of admiration, circulated widely online, becoming an instant meme that mocked the entire absurdity of Mr. Charles's governance. Every new memo and fine became fodder for satirical cartoons, parody videos, and biting commentary in local blogs. The community, once oppressed by the tyranny of trivial rules, found solace and empowerment in their shared laughter, and in their growing sense of unity against an overzealous enforcer of meaningless regulations. The shock factor of Mr. Charles's actions reached its zenith when he attempted to fine a local ice cream vendor for exceeding the ambient level of sweetness. The absurdity was too much to bear, and even those who had once accepted his edicts with resigned grumbles now erupted in uncontrollable mirth. Videos of the vendor's bewildered expression, as he clutched his ice cream cone while reading the offending memo, spread like wildfire on social media. This incident, among many others, became the rallying cry for the community's budding resistance. A vivid reminder that while Mr. Charles might have legal authority on paper, his true power was crumbling under the weight of his own ridiculousness. In the midst of this chaotic satire, Judge Alexander's role as the architect of poetic justice grew ever more prominent. Every fabricated fine, every absurd memo, was a testament to the dangers of unchecked authority and the inevitable downfall of those who abuse their power. Alexander's plan was unfolding with the precision of a well-rehearsed legal drama. Only this time, the courtroom was the entire neighborhood, and the verdict was as inevitable as it was hilariously deserved. As Mr. Charles continued his relentless campaign of fabricated violations and petty punishments, the community's spirit began to shift. The residents, once wary of the draconian rules, were now united by a common cause: to reclaim their right to live freely, laugh openly, and, above all, to resist the tyranny of nonsensical regulations. And in the heart of this rebellion stood Judge Alexander, whose keen intellect and satirical flair promised a retribution that would not only restore justice but do so with a flourish that was as entertaining as it was decisive. In the sanctum of his study, surrounded by towering stacks of legal tomes, meticulously organized memos, and a rather impressive collection of vintage law journals, Alexander began drafting a master plan that was equal parts cunning legal strategy and mischievous prank. Judge Alexander wasn't one to simply sit by and watch as Mr. Charles's absurd regulations strangled the very essence of suburban liberty. With the precision of a seasoned legal warrior, he combed through every bylaw, regulation, and policy enacted by the tyrannical HOA leader. Alexander soon discovered a labyrinth of legal technicalities and loopholes that Mr. Charles had unwittingly created in his quest for draconian control. Each memo of unauthorized sprinkler use, or excessive curbside cheerfulness, was now a bullet in the judge's legal arsenal. Armed with this arsenal, Judge Alexander began filing a series of lawsuits, each one crafted with the cunning humor of a courtroom jester. The lawsuits were as outrageous as they were meticulously prepared, designed not only to challenge Mr. Charles's authority but also to expose the ludicrous nature of his decrees. One lawsuit, for instance, alleged that Mr. Charles's mismatched garden gnome ban was a flagrant violation of artistic expression and the residents' constitutional right to decorative freedom. In another, Alexander charged Mr. Charles with malicious misinterpretation of horticultural aesthetics for imposing his color-coded shrub mandate. These legal actions were nothing short of a theatrical performance, a series of biting legal jabs delivered with the precision of a scalpel and the humor of a well-timed punchline. As the lawsuits piled up, so did the pressure on Mr. Charles. The once unflappable HOA leader began to display cracks in his imperious facade. His memos, which had once dripped with unassailable authority, now reeked of desperation. It became increasingly clear that he was outmatched by a man who wielded the law as both shield and sword, a man who could turn a petty regulation into a monument of absurdity. The turning point came during a particularly dramatic court session that felt more like a live comedy show than a legal proceeding. Judge Alexander, acting as both prosecutor and star performer, took to the stand to unveil a dossier of evidence that he had compiled with meticulous care. This dossier wasn't filled with dry legal jargon or sterile bullet points. It was a vibrant mosaic of humorous, undeniable proof of Mr. Charles's overreach. In one particularly shocking moment, Alexander presented a series of memos that Mr. Charles had sent out to residents. One memo, which had become infamous online, outlined the so-called guidelines for optimized lawn geometry, complete with diagrams, protractor measurements, and a stern warning about aesthetic anarchy. As Judge Alexander laid these documents before the court, he couldn't help but deliver a few sly remarks about the perils of living under a regime where even your dandelions are expected to conform to strict grid patterns. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of incredulous laughter and genuine shock. It was as if the absurdity of the evidence had reached a crescendo. Here was a man, so enamored with his own power, that he had transformed every minor infraction into a battle for control over the mundane. The evidence painted Mr. Charles not merely as an overzealous HOA manager, but as a full-blown despot whose every decree was an exercise in theatrical tyranny. Yet, the climax of Judge Alexander's masterstroke came when he decided to make a public spectacle of the evidence. In a press conference that felt more like a satirical variety show, Alexander unveiled a full-color slideshow detailing Mr. Charles's most preposterous regulations. The images ranged from charts on optimal gnome spacing to video clips of Mr. Charles sternly admonishing a resident for displaying excessive curbside cheerfulness. Each slide was punctuated by witty commentary and a dash of legal jargon that transformed the absurdities into an unequivocal indictment of tyranny. Residents, who had long suffered in silence under the yoke of Mr. Charles's regulations, cheered as each piece of evidence was displayed. Social media exploded with the hashtag gavel of guffaws, and what was once a community defined by bureaucratic oppression was now united in laughter and righteous indignation. It was a moment of collective catharsis, a reminder that humor could be the mightiest weapon against even the most absurd authority. Mr. Charles, caught in the glare of public scrutiny, attempted to defend his actions. In a fraught interview with a local news station, his voice trembled as he tried to justify his regulations as necessary for maintaining community decorum. But his words fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence and the palpable enthusiasm of a community that had had enough. The more he tried to cling to his self-important rhetoric, the more he revealed the true nature of his rule. Petty, insecure, and entirely out of touch with the very people he claimed to serve. Judge Alexander's legal maneuvers and public expose culminated in a final, decisive lawsuit. A class action suit that not only sought to dismantle Mr. Charles's tyrannical policies but also demanded restitution for the emotional distress caused by living under his absurd reign. The lawsuit was framed as a quest for justice, not just for the community at large, but for the very concept of free expression in suburban life. The courtroom drama that ensued was nothing short of epic. With every legal argument, Judge Alexander painted a picture of a tyrant who had overstepped every conceivable boundary of reason. He pointed out that the real victim was not just a group of disgruntled residents, but the very idea of community living, a concept that thrived on diversity, individuality, and, above all, humor. His closing arguments were laced with biting wit. "We are not here to enforce a rulebook written by a man with a protractor for a heart. We are here to reclaim our right to live in a place where our gardens, our laughter, and yes, even our mismatched gnomes are free." The verdict, when it came, was as swift as it was resounding. The court ruled in favor of the residents, declaring Mr. Charles's regulations null and void. The decision was hailed as a triumph of common sense and communal spirit over the tyranny of absurdity. In the days that followed, the community celebrated not only their newfound freedom but also the artistry with which justice had been served. The atmosphere was electric, a heady mix of disbelief and barely contained hilarity as neighbors, journalists, and even a few bemused onlookers gathered to witness a trial that promised not just to settle a dispute, but to dismantle an entire regime of absurdity. Judge Alexander, renowned for his razor-sharp intellect and irreverent wit, had spent months meticulously compiling a dossier of evidence, a veritable treasure trove of Mr. Charles's most preposterous edicts. From memos mandating that every hedge be trimmed at precisely a 45-degree angle to detailed diagrams specifying the optimal placement of garden gnomes, every document served as a brick in the towering wall of irony that was about to bring the HOA despot to his knees. When Mr. Charles was finally ushered to the stand, the once confident, imperious figure was noticeably diminished. His usual swagger was replaced by a nervous fidget, and the smirk that once accompanied every draconian decree was nowhere to be seen. Judge Alexander began his opening remarks with a tone that mingled gravitas with playful mockery. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we do not merely settle a legal matter. We reclaim our community from the clutches of absurd despotism. We stand here united, not only to restore our rights, but also to remind ourselves that even the most meticulously enforced nonsense will eventually crumble under the weight of common sense." Throughout the trial, every objection Mr. Charles raised was deftly countered by Alexander's satirical repartee. When Mr. Charles's legal team tried to dismiss the infamous gnome configuration regulation as a harmless attempt to maintain aesthetic order, Alexander quipped, "Harmless, gentlemen. These regulations are nothing more than the scaffolding of a regime that would see our creative freedoms reduced to a series of color-coded spreadsheets. We are witnessing, in essence, an aesthetic apartheid." The courtroom erupted with laughter, the sound echoing off the walls as even the stern-faced bailiff allowed a rare smile. One unforgettable moment came when Judge Alexander unveiled the Floral Fidelity exhibit. A slideshow of vibrant photographs showed a resident's lovingly tended rose bushes, juxtaposed with a memo from Mr. Charles condemning the excessive symmetry of the arrangement. With a dramatic flourish, Alexander remarked, "Here we witness nature's own masterpiece, ruined not by neglect, but by the tyrannical pursuit of geometric perfection. How can we allow the beauty of a naturally wild rose to be subjugated by the tyranny of an overzealous HOA?" The exhibit drew both applause and raucous laughter, as the absurdity of imposing a ruler on nature became hilariously undeniable. As the trial unfolded, Judge Alexander's evidence grew increasingly damning. He presented a series of emails, internal memos, and inspection reports that laid bare the systematic abuse of power. In one particularly ludicrous document, Mr. Charles had outlined fines for excessive laughter, complete with a chart categorizing acceptable chuckles by decibel level. Clearly, Alexander noted with a smirk, this is not a measure of public safety, but a desperate attempt to stifle the very human expression of joy. Each piece of evidence was delivered with the precision of a seasoned jurist and the irreverence of a master satirist. The trial's crescendo came when Judge Alexander unveiled his piece de resistance, a full-color slideshow that chronicled the evolution of Mr. Charles's edicts. The presentation ranged from guidelines for optimal law narration to the infamous prohibited levels of sunshine absorption. Each slide punctuated by animated graphics and humorous annotations. With every slide, the courtroom's energy surged. Laughter, clapping, and even a few cheers filled the space as the absurdity of the tyrant's regulations was laid bare in vivid detail. At one point, as the slideshow flashed a series of particularly outrageous fines, such as a penalty for unauthorized sprinkler choreography, Judge Alexander paused and addressed the assembly. Is this truly the legacy we want to leave behind? A community where even the simple act of watering one's lawn is subject to bureaucratic interference? Today, we say enough is enough. His words resonated deeply with the crowd, turning the trial into a cathartic celebration of common sense and communal defiance. By the end of the proceedings, it was clear that Mr. Charles's defenses were as brittle as his carefully contrived regulations. His attempts to justify the imposition of absurd fines only underscored his deep-seated insecurities and over-reliance on petty authority. In a final, dramatic flourish, Judge Alexander delivered his closing arguments, encapsulating the trial's spirit. We are not merely litigating a series of complaints. We are reclaiming our right to live freely, to express joy without fear, and to embrace the unpredictable beauty of our neighborhoods. Today, we turn the page on a chapter of tyranny, and we write a new story, a story where humor triumphs over hubris. The verdict, when it came, was nothing short of a resounding victory for the community. Mr. Charles was ordered to issue a public apology and pay hefty fines for the emotional distress inflicted upon the residents. Fines that, in a fitting twist, were calculated using the same absurd formulas he once championed. The courtroom roared in approval as justice, served with a side of satire, was delivered. In the days following the trial, the neighborhood transformed. The oppressive edicts were rescinded, and residents took to the streets with impromptu celebrations, parading their newly reclaimed freedom and laughing at the memory of those outrageous rules. Judge Alexander's triumph had not only dismantled a reign of petty tyranny, but had also rekindled a sense of unity and humor among the people. It was a moment of poetic justice, a reminder that no matter how high the walls of absurdity are built, they can always be brought down by the relentless force of common sense and a well-aimed legal brief. Before we bring this tale of satirical retribution and sweet revenge to a close, I want to remind you that this isn't just a story about a community's battle against absurd regulations. It's a celebration of the human spirit's capacity to rise, laugh, and fight back against injustice. If you enjoyed this epic saga of wit and justice, please do us a favor. Like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that blend humor with the power of retribution.